Hello guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Lucia and this is Lulu's Leaves.
I'm no good at being good, but I never said I was. And I feel misunderstood, cause I'm trying hard to love.
In today's video, I am going to be doing a long overdue video. I am going to be talking to you guys about some care tips that I have for my Philodendron Gloriosum. As you guys know, I have had this plant for quite some time now, and it's really grown on me and it's very, very special to me. This plant was definitely on my first ever rare plant wish list, and I was able to get this guy about a year ago now, and since then, it has completely regrown every single leaf that it has. I don't think that this plant has any of its original leaves left over, so obviously it's doing really well, and I want to give you guys some tips so that you can grow yours into a big, beautiful Gloriosum as well. Before I do get into those tips and tricks though, if you guys are not already subscribed to my channel, definitely click that button down below and give this video a thumbs up. Also, if you guys are not already a member, definitely go check that out in the description down below. If you join at any tier, you gain access to an awesome Discord group chat where we talk all day long about houseplants. And if you want to join at the top 2 tiers, you also gain access to some extra content. So that is really, really exciting. We have been gaining so many new members over the last little bit, and the community is just growing so amazingly. So definitely, if you're interested, check that out down below. It is a fun time for sure. But yeah, that's going to be all before we get into this video. I really hope you guys do enjoy it. Before I get into the tips and tricks on how to best care for this plant, I do want to mention that this is an endangered species in the wild. So I really do encourage you guys to make sure that you're buying from sellers who are not poaching these plants from the wild. There are definitely great sellers out there who are propagating their own plants and making new plants for you guys, and that's totally sustainable. And I absolutely recommend you getting one if you can find one that's ethically sourced. But I also just wanted to give you guys as much information as I could give you because, you know, this is a really special plant and we definitely don't want to see it become extinct in the wild. While a lot of us do have these plants in our personal collections, unfortunately, they're dwindling in the wild. So just keep that in mind when you're looking for a Gloriosum. By giving you guys the best advice possible though, hopefully we can keep this plant growing in our collections and keep them really nice and healthy so that we can continue to share them with our friends. So I thought I'd start off with, the basics with this plant. Where do you start when you get this house plant? Well, you're probably going to be thinking about repotting it because it might not be in the soil that you're comfortable using, or it might be in sphagnum moss and it's ready to be planted in soil. So yeah, let's discuss what kind of soil is best for this house plant and why. Similar to many other philodendrons, this plant loves to have really chunky soil and something that's really airy so that the roots can breathe. The best way to accomplish that is to add stuff to your soil mixture. So what I would recommend is a blend of 30% soil, 30% perlite, and 40% bark. This is the best way to get a really, really chunky mixture for your plant, and it will also help you prevent root rot. This plant has actually gone through a little bit of struggles with root rot, but it is such a resilient plant that I never actually noticed it showing up in the leaves. The first time I potted this plant up, I actually made a video about it. I will tag that video above in the cards. It was a really fun video, but I potted this plant up. There were actually 2 of them. I potted it up into a 14-inch pot, and at the time, it was probably a little bit large for this plant. And maybe it wasn't too large, but I didn't add enough to the soil for it to make sense. So when I went to repot it, I did notice a little bit of root rot that also could have been from underwatering or overwatering this plant. Likely underwatering because I don't water it often, but we'll get into watering a little bit later. But anyways, when I did notice a little bit of root rot, I cut it off, and then I decided to plant this guy in some extra chunky soil. And it's been super happy since. We've had so many amazing new leaves that I will show off a little bit later in this video. But yeah, definitely recommend a chunky soil mixture for the Philodendron Gloriosum. as it really thrives in that condition. Another really important thing to note when you are potting up your plant is that the Gloriosum is a crawler. So what that means is this plant doesn't grow up trees, it actually crawls across the jungle floor. And it does so with its little stolon. That is what you call the stem on this plant. It's where each of the leaves come out of and it crawls across the ground. It's really important that you make sure you're not burying the stolon underneath your soil level, or if you're using leca, make sure that it's still above the surface level because it will rot. When I got my first Philodendron Gloriosum, the stolon was actually buried beneath the soil level. And I understand that it can be really difficult to prop your plant up when it's a little bit younger because that stolon isn't as mature and there aren't as many roots attached to it. But I promise you, if you stake it up for the time being, it will root enough into the soil that you will be able to take that stake out and it will balance on its own. But make sure, even if you're having a little bit of trouble balancing your plant, that you do make sure that stolon is above the surface level. It's also really important that your pots have drainage holes. Pots can be a little bit difficult when it comes to the Gloriosum because it is a crawler. It outgrows the pot really quickly, and the actual plant will outgrow the pot before the roots do. And that does make it a little bit difficult. It means you're probably going to have to repot this plant about once a year, if not more, if it's growing really intensely. And one way that you can avoid repotting it too often is actually by putting it in a rectangular pot. Obviously, I have not done that. It's really hard to find a nice looking rectangular pot in this size. I actually have it in such a massive pot right now. I was luckily able to find a nice white one, but it is really difficult. But I do want to stress that you need a drainage hole, especially when these pots get larger in size. Usually they don't come with drainage holes. So you're going to have to drill a hole if your current pot doesn't have one, or put it in a nursery pot within your cover pot. This plant also has surprising light requirements. I thought when I got this plant that I would need to put it in a super bright area to get really nice, big, beautiful leaves. And fortunately, that's not really the case. In my whole time having this plant, I've had it in medium to low light. And as you can see, it is super happy and it's pushing out really dark, beautiful leaves. I also found when I had a grow light directly on this plant that the leaves were actually fading in color. So yeah, if you want these nice dark leaves, I actually recommend keeping your plant in lower light. Low light doesn't mean no light though. I've definitely had some instances where this plant has been in too low of light and the leaves don't come out quick enough and eventually they do rot in the sheath. And unfortunately that's just the case if you're not giving this plant enough light. That's how it goes, but low light will work and it actually works really, really well. So just make sure that it's getting some light, some indirect light, but it doesn't have to be anything crazy. You don't have to shove this plant up against a south-facing window. This could be just happy close to a north-facing window, and it actually could be happier than if it were in a south-facing window. So yeah, just keep that in mind. If you want these nice dark leaves, make sure that the lighting is not too intense. Because this plant is a crawler and not a climber, you actually don't need any support for this plant to grow to its fullest potential. I personally do have support in this pot, but it's really just there so I can Velcro these leaves into different positions to make the plant a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. A lot of the times this plant grows in weird directions. Obviously they like to turn towards the sun. I definitely like to arrange the leaves in a certain way, and the way that I do that is using a stake and some green Velcro tape. So don't be afraid of putting a stake in your Gloriosum's pot. Even though it isn't a climbing plant and it doesn't need it to succeed, it actually could help improve the look of your plant if that matters to you. And it's definitely not the end of the world, but this plant is a big statement piece for my plant room, and it's just helpful, you know, to set the scene. I also briefly touched on this. Definitely rotate your plant. Because the leaves do grow towards the sun, you definitely don't want the front of the plant to be super full and bushy and then the back to be nothing. This plant is a little bit like that because of where it is. It's against a wall, so there's actually not a ton of room on the back side of the plant. But this is the way that I like it. If you do want a plant that's just really pretty from one direction, maybe don't rotate it. But if you want one that's nice and full all the way around, rotate your plant. It's as easy as that. Next up, I want to talk about how often I water this plant. And honestly, it's not very often at all. This plant is very, very low maintenance in terms of lighting, in terms of humidity, in terms of water. It is just such an easygoing plant, and it actually likes to be really dry. I find I water this plant about once a month in this large pot. Obviously, if you keep your plant in a smaller pot, you are going to have to water it a bit more frequently. But what I like to do is I like to let the plant dry out completely, and then I wait a week, and then I water the plant. I find this plant grows best when it has a little bit of a dry period. I don't know why that is. It is a jungle plant, but again, like many other philodendrons, this plant does like to stay relatively dry. That's another reason this plant really likes that fast draining soil. It really doesn't want to be soaking wet or those roots will rot. It's pretty straightforward and definitely tells you what it wants. I wouldn't say this plant necessarily droops very often, even when it is thirsty, even when it's been, a month and a half and I haven't watered this plant, it still looks really nice. So you are going to have to test the soil to make sure that it's ready to be watered, because the leaves really aren't going to tell you unless it's a dire situation and you should have watered weeks ago. When those leaves are coming out, I know this is a little bit controversial, but because I do keep it in lower light, I talked about how sometimes the leaves will get stuck in the sheaths. This is pretty common when it comes to philodendrons, and especially because this plant likes to stay dry, it does end up running into some sheath trouble. So what I like to do is I actually will rip off as much of the sheath as I can when I see a new leaf emerging, and that just really helps to avoid any ripping of the leaf. Definitely, if that sheath is really tight around the plant, don't go at it. It might actually end up ripping the plant even more, but I have saved a lot of these leaves from ripping because I've removed some of the sheath. The leaves come in really thin and then they eventually obviously harden like many leaves do, but yeah, they are super sensitive when they're coming out. So be really careful around the leaves. They are really easy to rip. I'm also just going to brush right over humidity. This plant does not need any added humidity whatsoever. I've had this plant in 20% humidity in the winter and it's just fine. It might grow a little bit slower, and again, those sheaths may get a little bit stuck every once in a while, but if you spray the sheath or if you spray the plant with some water, I find that works really well. I've never had any spotting on the leaves because of water droplets, but if you are keeping your plant in more direct light, or if it's closer to a south-facing window where it might get a little bit of direct light during the day, make sure that there are no water droplets that will burn the leaves. Well guys, that takes us to the last portion of this video, which I think a lot of you guys are probably here for too. I'm going to be talking about how I propagate my Philodendron Gloriosum. I have propagated this guy many a times over the last little bit. I think this plant has probably put out 20 leaves for me since I got it. But as a new plant parent, I definitely wanted to trade, and this was a hot commodity. A lot of people were willing to trade some really exciting plants for some leaves off my Gloriosum. So obviously, I wanted to cut this guy up and share with my friends. So that's what I did, and I had a lot of success with my propagations. The reason I had a lot of success with my propagations is because I allowed the plant to root before I ever made a cut. This is really, really important with this plant specifically. I know there are a lot of houseplants out there that you can cut, but in my experience, your propagations will lose leaves if you're not waiting until they have roots. So the best way to do this is to either air layer your plant, or if it's growing across the soil level, oftentimes those roots will already be digging into the soil as the stolon grows. So if you've never propagated your plant before, you may get lucky and be able to make a cut immediately because of the way that the roots grow on this plant. But if you've made a few cuts in the past and your plant has started to kind of grow up and above the soil, you're probably not going to get the same luck. And in that case, I definitely recommend air layering. I don't personally have a video on air layering. I've touched on it briefly in a few other videos, but I will leave a video down below all about air layering by my friend Ashley. Once you've figured out that you have some roots, all you have to do is cut between the nodes. The nodes on this plant are actually very visible, and it makes it really easy to cut this plant up. Wherever you see a ridge along the stolon, that is a node. You're also likely going to see the auxiliary bud because on these crawling plants, they are a little bit more prominent. And that is where your new growth is going to come from. If it's a mid cutting or if it's a top cutting, it will probably just continue to grow from the original growth point. But yeah, it's honestly such an easy plant to propagate. Just make sure you have roots before you begin. Well guys, that is going to be all for this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit more about the Philodendron Gloriosum, and I hope you guys got some helpful tips that will improve the life of your little Gloriosum at home, or hopefully this, enticed you to maybe look for one. Again, make sure that you are getting plants from responsible sources. Make sure that these plants are not being picked from the wild, but ethically grown instead. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and subscribe down below. Also, if you're not already a member of my channel, definitely go check that out. There is a link in the description down below, or there's a join button if you see it. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, but yeah, that's going to be all for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!